Chapter 9. Lenina felt herself entitled, after this day of queerness and horror, to a complete and absolute holiday. As soon as they got back to the rest house, she swallowed 6 half-gram tablets of soma, lay down on her bed, and within 10 minutes had embarked for lunar eternity. It would be 18 hours at the least before she was in time again. Bernard, meanwhile, lay pensive and wide-eyed in the dark. It was long after midnight before he fell asleep. Long after midnight, but his insomnia had not been fruitless. He had a plan. Punctually, on the following morning, at 10 o'clock, the green-uniformed Doctoroon stepped out of his helicopter. Bernard was waiting for him among the agaves. "Miss Crown's gone on soma holiday," he explained. "Can hardly be back before 5, which leaves us 7 hours. He could fight a Santa Fe, do all the business he had to do, and be in Malpais again long before she woke up. She'll be quite safe here by herself?" "Safe as helicopters," the Octoroon assured him. They climbed into the machine and started off at once. At 10:34 they landed on the roof of the Santa Fe post office. At 10:37 Bernard had got through to the World Controller's office in Whitehall. At 10:39 he was speaking to his Ford ship's 4th personal secretary. At 10:44 he was repeating his story to the first secretary, and at 10:47 and a half it was the deep resonant voice of Mustapha Mond himself that sounded in his ears. "I ventured to think," stammered Bernard, "that your Ford ship might find the matter of sufficient scientific interest." "Yes, I do find it of sufficient scientific interest," said the deep voice. "Bring these 2 individuals back to London with you. Your Ford ship is aware that I shall need a special permit." "The necessary orders," said Mustapha Mond, "are being sent to the warden of the reservation at this moment. You will proceed at once to the warden's office. Good morning, Mr. Marks." There was silence. Bernard hung up the receiver and hurried up to the roof. "Warden's office," he said to the gamma-green Octoroon. At 10:54 Bernard was shaking hands with the warden. "Delighted, Mr. Marks, delighted." His boom was deferential. "We have just received special orders." "I know," said Bernard, interrupting him. "I was talking to his Ford ship on the phone a moment ago." His bored tone implied that he was in the habit of talking to his Ford ship every day of the week. He dropped into a chair. "If you'll kindly take all the necessary steps as soon as possible." "As soon as possible," he emphatically repeated. He was thoroughly enjoying himself. At 11:03 he had all the necessary papers in his pocket. "So long," he said patronizingly to the warden, who had accompanied him as far as the lift gates. "So long." He walked across to the hotel, had a bath, a vibrovac massage, and an electrolytic shave, listened into the morning's news, looked in for half an hour on the televisor, ate a leisured luncheon, and at 2:30 flew back with the Octoroon to Malpais. The young man stood outside the rest house. "Bernard," he called. "Bernard!" There was no answer. Noiseless on his deerskin moccasins, he ran up the steps and tried the door. The door was locked. They were gone! Gone! It was the most terrible thing that had ever happened to him. She had asked him to come and see them, and now they were gone. He sat down on the steps and cried. Half an hour later it occurred to him to look through the window. The first thing he saw was a green suitcase with the initials LC painted on the lid. Joy flared up like fire within him. He picked up a stone. The smashed glass tinkled on the floor. A moment later he was inside the room. He opened the green suitcase, and all at once he was breathing Lenina's perfume, filling his lungs with her essential being. His heart beat wildly. For a moment he was almost faint. Then, bending over the precious box, he touched, he lifted into the light, he examined. The zippers on Lenina's spare pair of Vico's velveteen shorts were at first a puzzle, then solved, a delight. Zip, and then zip, zip, and then zip. He was enchanted. Her green slippers were the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He unfolded a pair of Zipicaminics, blushed, put them hastily away again, kissed a perfumed acetate handkerchief and wound a scarf round his neck. Opening a box, he spilt a cloud of scented powder. His hands were floury with the stuff. He wiped them on his chest, on his shoulders, on his bare arms. Delicious perfume. He shut his eyes. He rubbed his cheek against his own powdered arm. Touch of smooth skin against his face. Scent in his nostrils of musky dust. Her real presence. "Lenina," he whispered. "Lenina." A noise made him start, made him guiltily turn. He crammed up his feveries into the suitcase and shut the lid, then listened again, looked. Not a sign of life, not a sound. And yet he had certainly heard something. Something like a sigh, something like the creak of a board. He tiptoed to the door and, cautiously opening it, found himself looking onto a broad landing. On the opposite side of the landing was another door, ajar. He stepped out, pushed, peeped. There, on a low bed, the sheet flung back, dressed in a pair of pink one-piece zippy pajamas, lay Lenina, fast asleep and so beautiful, in the midst of her curls, so touchingly childish of her pink toes and her grave sleeping face, so trustful in the helplessness of her limp hands and melted limbs, that the tears came to his eyes. With an infinity of quite unnecessary precautions, for nothing short of a pistol shot could have called Lenina back from her summer holiday before the appointed time, he entered the room, he knelt on the floor beside the bed. He gazed, he clasped his hands, his lips moved. Her eyes, he murmured. Her eyes, her hair, her cheek, her gait, her voice. Handless in thy discourse, oh, that her hand, in whose comparison all whites are ink, writing their own reproach, to whose soft seizure the signet's down is harsh. A fly buzzed round her, he waved it away. Flies, he remembered, on the white wonder of dear Juliet's hand, may seize and steal a mortal blessing from her lips, who, even in pure and vestal modesty, still blush as thinking their own kisses sin. Very slowly, with the hesitating gesture of one who reaches forward to stroke a shy and possibly rather dangerous bird, he put out his hand. It hung there trembling, within an inch of those limp fingers, on the verge of contact. Did he dare? Dare to profane with his unworthiest hand that? No, he didn't. The bird was too dangerous. His hand dropped back. How beautiful she was. How beautiful. Then suddenly he found himself reflecting that he had only to take hold of the zipper at her neck and give one long, strong pull. He shut his eyes. He shook his head with the gesture of a dog shaking its ears as it emerges from the water. Detestable thought. He was ashamed of himself. Pure and vestal modesty. There was a humming in the air. Another fly trying to steal immortal blessings? A wasp? He looked, saw nothing. The humming grew louder and louder, localized itself as being outside the shuttered windows. The plane! In a panic, he scrambled to his feet and ran into the other room, vaulted through the open window, and hurrying along the path between the tall agaves was in time to receive Bernard Marks as he climbed out of the helicopter. Chapter 10. The hands of all the 4,000 electric clocks in all the Bloomsbury Centre's 4,000 rooms marked 27 minutes past 2. This hive of industry, as the director is fond of calling it, was in the full buzz of work. Everyone was busy, everything in ordered motion. Under the microscopes, their long tails furiously lashing, spermatozoa were burrowing headfirst into eggs. And, fertilized, the eggs were expanding, dividing, or if Bokanovskified, budding and breaking up into whole populations of separate embryos. From the social predestination room, the escalators went rumbling down into the basement, and there, in the crimson darkness, stewing warm on their cushion of peritoneum and gorged with blood, surrogate, and hormones, the fetuses grew or, poisoned, languished into a stunted epsilonhood. With a faint hum and rattle, the moving racks crawled imperceptibly through the weeks and their recapitulated aeons to where, in the decanting room, the newly unbottled babes uttered their first yell of horror and amazement. The dynamos purred in the sub-basement, the lifts rushed up and down. On the 11 floors of nurseries it was feeding time. From 1,800 bottles, 1,800 carefully labelled infants were simultaneously sucking down their pint of pasteurized external secretion. Above them, in the intense successive layers of dormitory, the little boys and girls who were still young enough to need an afternoon's sleep were as busy as everyone else, though they did not know it, listening unconsciously to hypnopedic lessons in hygiene and sociability, in class consciousness and the toddler's love life. Above these again were the playrooms where, the weather having turned to rain, 900 older children were amusing themselves with bricks and clay modelling, Hunt the Zipper, and erotic play. Buzz, buzz, the hive was humming, busily, joyfully. Blithe was the singing of the young girls over their test tubes. The predestinators whistled as they worked, and in the decanting room what glorious jokes are cracked above the empty bottles. But the director's face, as he entered the fertilizing room with Henry Foster, was grave, wooden with severity. A public example, he was saying. In this room, because it contains more high-caste workers than any other in the centre, I have told him to meet me here at 2:30. He does his work very well, put in Henry with hypocritical generosity. I know, but that's all the more reason for severity. His intellectual eminence carries with it corresponding moral responsibilities. The greater a man's talents, the greater his power to lead astray. It is better that one should suffer than that many should be corrupted. Consider the matter dispassionately, Mr. Foster, and you will see that no offence is so heinous as unorthodoxy of behaviour. Murder kills only the individual, and after all, what is an individual? With a sweeping gesture, he indicated the rows of microscopes, the test tubes, the incubators. We can make a new one for the greatest ease, as many as we like. Unorthodoxy threatens more than just the life of a mere individual. It strikes at society itself. Yes, at society itself, he repeated. Ah, but here he comes. Bernard had entered the room and was advancing between the rows of fertilizers toward them. A veneer of jaunty self-confidence thinly concealed his nervousness. The voice in which he said, "Good morning, Director," was absurdly too loud. That in which, correcting his mistake, he said, "You asked me to come and speak to you here," ridiculously soft, a squeak. Yes, Mr. Marks, said the director portentously. I did ask you to come to me here. You returned from your holiday last night, I understand. Yes, Bernard answered. Yes, repeated the director, lingering, a serpent, on the S. Then, suddenly raising his voice, Ladies and gentlemen, he trumpeted. Ladies and gentlemen. The singing of the girls over their test tubes, the preoccupied whistling of the microscopists, suddenly ceased. There was a profound silence. Everyone looked round. Ladies and gentlemen, the director repeated once more, excuse me for thus interrupting your labours. A painful duty constrains me. The security and stability of society are in danger. Yes, in danger, ladies and gentlemen. This man, he pointed accusingly at Bernard, this man who stands before you here, this Alpha Plus to whom so much has been given, and from whom in consequence so much must be expected, this colleague of yours, or should I anticipate and say this ex-colleague, has grossly betrayed the trust imposed in him. By his heretical views on sport and soma, by the scandalous unorthodoxy of his sex life, by his refusal to obey the teachings of Al Ford and behave out of office hours, even as a little infant, here the director made the sign of the T, he has proved himself an enemy of society, a subverter, ladies and gentlemen, of all order and stability, a conspirator against civilization itself. For this reason I propose to dismiss him with ignominy from the post he has held in this centre. I propose forthwith to apply for his transference to a sub-centre of the lowest order, and that his punishment may serve the best interest of society, as far as possible removed from any important centre of population. In Iceland he will have small opportunity to lead others astray by his unfordly example. The director paused, then, folding his arms, he turned impressively to Bernard. Marx, he said, can you show any reason why I should not now execute the judgment passed upon you? Yes, I can, Bernard answered in a very loud voice. Somewhat taken aback, but still majestically. Then show it, said the director. Certainly, but it's in the passage. One moment. Bernard hurried to the door and threw it open. Come in, he commanded, and the reason came in and showed itself. There was a gasp, a murmur of astonishment and horror. A young girl screamed. Standing on a chair to get a better view, someone upset 2 test tubes full of spermatozoa. Bloated, sagging, and among those firm, youthful bodies, those undistorted faces, a strange and terrifying monster of middle-agedness. Linda advanced into the room, coquettishly smiling her broken and discoloured smile, and rolling as she walked with what was meant to be a voluptuous undulation, her enormous haunches. Bernard walked beside her. There he is, he said, pointing at the director. Did you think I didn't recognize him? Linda asked indignantly. Then, turning to the director, Of course I knew you, Tomakin. I should have known you anywhere, among 1,000. But perhaps you've forgotten me. Don't you remember? Don't you remember, Tomakin? You're Linda. She stood looking at him, her head on one side, still smiling, or with a smile that became progressively, in the face of the director's expression of petrified disgust, less and less self-confident, that wavered and finally went on. Don't you remember, Tomakin? She repeated in a voice that trembled. Her eyes were anxious, agonized. The blotched and sagging face twisted grotesquely into the grimace of extreme grief. Tomakin! She held out her arms. Someone began to titter. What's the meaning, began the director, of this monstrous... Tomakin! She ran forward, her blanket trailing behind her, threw her arms round his neck, hid her face on his chest. A howl of laughter went up irrepressibly. This monstrous practical joke! The director shouted. Red in the face, he tried to disengage himself from her embrace. Desperately she clung. But I'm Linda! I'm Linda! The laughter drowned her voice. You made me have a baby, she screamed above the uproar. There was a sudden and appalling hush. Eyes floated uncomfortably, not knowing where to look. The director went suddenly pale, stopped struggling and stood, his hands on her wrists, staring down at her, horrified. Yes, a baby, and I was its mother. She flung the obscenity like a challenge into the outraged silence. Then, suddenly breaking away from him, ashamed, covered her face with her hands, sobbing. It wasn't my fault, Tomakin, because I always did my drill, didn't I? Didn't I? Always. I don't know how. If you knew how awful, Tomakin. But he was a comfort to me all the same. Turning towards the door. John! She called. John! He came in at once, paused for a moment just inside the door, looked round, then soft on his moccasined feet, strode quickly across the room, fell on his knees in front of the director, and said in a clear voice, My father! The word, for father, was not so much obscene as, with its connotation of something at one removed from the loathsomeness and moral obliquity of childbearing, merely gross, eschatological rather than a pornographic impropriety. The comically smutty word relieved what had become a quite intolerable tension. Laughter broke out. enormous, almost hysterical, peal after peal, as though it would never stop. My father, and it was the director. My father. Oh, Ford, that was really too good. The whooping and the roaring renewed themselves. Faces seemed on the point of disintegration. Tears were streaming. 6 more test tubes of spermatozoa were upset. My father! Pale, wild-eyed, the director glared about him in an agony of bewildered humiliation. My father! The laughter, which had shown signs of dying away, broke out again more loudly than ever. He put his hands over his ears and rushed out of the room.